Hi everyone and welcome to Protecht's next Enterprise Risk Management webinar, focusing on what I can only say is a very hot topic, looking at AI, but particularly looking at AI risk and related controls. And one of the things that we're finding is the excitement around AI, what it can do and how it's going to change the world. But we then get this kind of fear and reluctance to adopt because of the fear of the related risks. And this session is all about how do we get our risk management through controls really working well on AI so that we're able to pursue the opportunity to use it while not getting ourselves into trouble. Now, in terms of all your hosts, there'll be myself and also my good colleague Michael. Michael, I'll get you to introduce yourself for a second and then we'll get going.
Thanks, David. So I'm the Senior Manager of Research and Content at Protecht. So it does entail looking after a lot of our, as the title would suggest, research into the world of risk. I'm a risk nerd by nature and develop a lot of our content around blogs, webinars, ebooks, and so on, and also supporting our systems. I also look after our on-demand product, Protecht Academy, and perhaps I'll hand over to you, David, to talk about the rest of the research and content team, being you.
Great, thank you. And yeah, my name's David, Chief Research and Content Officer. The title speaks for itself and it's perfect for also a risk nerd, doing a lot of thinking around where risk management is going and obviously dealing with such things as AI when it pops up and how do you incorporate the management of AI risks into your overarching enterprise risk management framework. Now, before we get going, a little bit of housekeeping. So typically around 60 minutes. In terms of questions, if you could please enter your questions into the webinar control panel under the questions, and we will take those and answer those as a blog after the webinar, and that will be shared with you. There's also a recording of this that will also be linked to the email that goes out to you afterwards, so you can watch it again or share it with your colleagues. And we also ask of you right at the end to just spend a minute or so doing our post-webinar questionnaire feedback form, because it really helps us to improve our future webinars. So in terms of what we're going to cover, we're going to cover really 6 aspects of AI risk and controls. The first one is, why are we needing to control AI? Now, that may seem fairly obvious, but there's a really big opportunity in doing great controls management around AI, and particularly getting people to think about the why from a value add perspective rather than a control as a hindrance. Secondly, what are the key AI risks and controls? What should you be conscious of? And as a result, that feeds into what controls do you need to have in place to manage that. Thirdly, how should AI risk be managed? What are the main techniques and how does it kind of differ slightly from other risks and other controls? Fourthly, who should manage AI risks? Do we need a specialist team or is it something else? Something else, as we're going to talk about. Fifthly, what should be the cadence in AI risk management? When should you be doing it and what are the characteristics of AI risk that kind of feed into determining what the cadence and the timeliness and the frequency of risk management should be? Finally, we're going to finish the output of risk management, which is reporting to be used for your various recipients, your risk committees, your board, what reporting is required and why. So first of all, let's take a look at why controlling AI actually matters. Now, before we start, I sometimes like to use analogies, those of you that have been on previous webinars, and my brain thinks in analogies. So as soon as I kind of consider AI, what do I think? I think, well, have we been here before? And I think we have. And I want to introduce the AI super employee. And this employee that you have available to yourselves potentially is extremely fast in what they do. Give a request, generally 15, 30, 45 seconds later, you have a wonderful report, you have a lovely new picture, and so on. They're very knowledgeable and skilled about everything, or pretty much everything, or they seem to think they are anyway. They're available 24/7, 365. They never sleep, they never get tired, they don't get hungover, don't have relationship issues, which is kind of cool. And they're relatively cost effective, although as they become more and more famous, the pricing of them tends to go up. I guess it's called demand and supply. Now that's the good news, but like any super employee, we've got some buts. Number one, they can make things up. They like to hallucinate a little bit. Very imaginative. They don't explain very well how they came up with their responses. So it's sometimes a bit opaque, and it's very hard to kind of have an audit trail in the conclusions that they call it or that they come up with. They can be quite careless with the data that you share with them. Like they take some data home in their briefcase, they stop for a coffee and they kind of loosely lose it all, and you've got yourself a problem. They also can be inaccurate, and they tend to have quite a lot of bias. And it's really interesting is I used ChatGPT to create the image on the right. And I first initially put in, I do a super employee at a desk with a laptop on a keyboard. And it returned a very, very good looking 25-year-old male, white male. Bias. I then wanted to get diversity. So I put in, let's make that person female. And I got a young female. I then went further and put in a middle-aged, someone of color, and I had to prompt it to get diversity. That's a classic case of bias. I deliberately didn't go to my other ones to prove the point, and I stopped at attempt number 2, but we've still got quite a lot of bias. Now, to put that all together, thinking about what AI is and using the Oxford Dictionary definition, which I quite like, it's the theory and development of computer systems able to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence, such as visual perception, speech, decision-making, and translation between languages. Now, with that as a basis of our thinking about AI, I want you always to think, if you had this super employee, what risks come with them and what controls would you put in place to manage those risks? Now, before we go in depth into having a look at AI risks and moving it across to real AI, not the super employee, I really want to think about the value add of really good AI risk controls. Firstly, risks are substantial and complex in relation to AI. Now, I found over the years there's not many new types of risk. It's just the way they behave and operate can be a little bit different. So humans are biased. AI is biased, but the way they're biased is slightly different. So what you don't know about or do not manage could really hurt you. So you need to be fully aware. Secondly, one option is to not use AI. We've come across people that go, we just don't need it. We've banned it internally. Well, you are missing a huge opportunity if that's the approach you're going to do. It's a bit like saying when cars were invented, no, I prefer my horse. That's not going to get you propelled into the future very well. So what does that mean? Strong AI controls and risk management will enable you to use AI while staying safe. I like to think it's your license to join the AI race. People in previous webinars will know I sometimes talk about a hobby I used to have called hang gliding. And one of my key controls was the parachute. And when I put the parachute on, the number one thought I had was, now I can have some fun. Now I can get up to 12,000 feet. I can do some wing overs, but I've got my risk management in place, which will allow me to go home safely to my family. What did it do? It enabled me to enjoy that wonderful sport of hang gliding by having great controls in place. That is how you should consider controls. They are a license to operate. Why have I got the car on the right-hand side? For the normal story I tell, why does a Formula One car have very expensive carbon fiber brakes? A lot of people think it's to stop, so on. It's to allow the car to go faster because the objective is to win the race. And given that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, we need controls in place to get a better chance to achieve our objectives. And straight away, controls are enablers. So think about controls over AI risk being enablers to allow you to use AI and get the business benefit of doing it. It's a license to race. Now, we've talked a bit about analogies and super employees. Now we need to get a bit more specific, and I'm going to pass over to Michael to have a look at where we are with AI in real terms. Michael.
Thanks, David. Now, AI is not a new term, and we're not going to go through a complete history lesson, but it's been around for decades, since the early 60s, when the term artificial intelligence was first coined. And for a few decades, we've had machine learning models, and it's really been the explosion of generative AI models over the last few years, particularly after the launch of ChatGPT was kind of the big explosion, and there's been many other models like that, image generators, large language models, multimodal models that have come out that have led to this, the zeitgeist around AI. And beyond that, we're looking forward to what is artificial general intelligence. What could that look like? Artificial super intelligence. And so this is from Alan Thompson's Life Architects, a great resource for those who want to have a look. But he's pulled together these two, I guess, guidelines for what levels of AI or an AGI might we be looking at, and how we're building up towards that. And at the moment, we're sort of hinting on that point. We're up to just turning over to level 3, where a lot of these large language models can already do a lot of tests that many humans either don't perform quite as well, or they're getting up into that upper range of a lot of these maths Olympiads or areas of specialization. As David said earlier, they are really good at lots and lots of things. Maybe not perfect, and again, they might be biased, and it might depend on the types of tests that they're doing or being given, but are getting up there in that range. On the left is more about the individual AI, but the open AI is looking a bit more at an agent kind of level, where we are now looking at AI that can take actions on our behalf. So they're either integrated into systems, or they are able to take action on our behalf. So I want to give you one specific example that's fairly recent. Just move to the next slide, please, David. Anthropic have released, or in beta, Claude has a computer use function, which means that you can ask it to manage your computer on your behalf. It can start moving the mouse, it can take screenshots, understand where things are on your desktop. So if you've got a lot of copy and pasting that you do across multiple applications, let's say in a business context, a customer relationship management piece of software, you can get it to do a lot of those tasks on your behalf. It is actually really acting on your behalf. A couple other areas where we're seeing this is actually in gaming, video gaming, where you might have non-player characters who are all have or driven by large language models, where you actually have multiple agents acting as the characters that you relate with, making it much more immersive. Now, you might not be interested in video games, but for risk managers, thinking about scenarios, business continuity, disruptions, and having all of the different actors, third parties that you would play in those scenarios could actually be played by a large language model, and seeing how all of those agents interact with each other to provide some of the outcomes and keep your organization resilient. That might be a little bit forward looking, but we already have AI that is acting as agents for us. And so here's some stats that I only recently found out about Waymo. It's not something I followed closely, which were actually quite surprising to me. Maybe that's our own personal bias as well, where I wouldn't have thought that autonomous vehicles are that safe or things that we might trust. But these statistics show that these things are really coming along. And we've had autonomous vehicles for a number of years. These are not particularly new. They're just not widespread in terms of their use, replacing people driving cars at this stage. Now, one thing perhaps to be said about this is that these statistics are based on Waymo and any other organization. When you look at accidents for individuals, for drivers, that is a responsibility of the driver. But once you start thinking about these statistics, maybe there will be a bit of lumpiness where if there are glitches, cyber attacks, some form of risks that occur with the organization, they might be a bit lumpier and they'll be a lot more noticeable when they happen. But it puts that responsibility from the individual back to organizations. And so then another reason that we need to think about controlling AI is the regulatory drivers that fall behind that. So one of the key I guess pieces of legislation that's come out or is now in force is the EU AI Act. So that is the front runner for legislation across the globe, but there are many others that are out there at the moment. So we had the executive order out of the United States. Now the question is, will that be repealed now that we've moved into or transitioning to a new government? Trump has said he intends to repeal it. Obviously, find out whether that happens. But that executive order also drove the development of the NIST AI risk management framework. So that's a voluntary framework, but it is related or driven from that executive order. And NIST have also released a profile that they call them, an AI profile for generative AI specifically. So that is a development that I think we will obviously watch as the new government transitions in early next year. Various others around the globe. Here in Australia, we've got the guardrails that have been proposed, very closely related, or that discussion paper, the proposal paper, references the EU AI Act quite a lot. Is it going to be principles-based? Are we going to have a list of particular prohibited and high-risk items, which we'll get to in a moment? So there is a lot of play from a regulatory perspective at the moment. Beyond that, we're looking at things like transparency, explainability. These are all themes that we're seeing across all of these regulatory regimes. So if we delve into the EU AI Act as being a bit of a basis, and if you're not currently regulated in the EU, it's still a good, I guess, starting point for thinking about the things that you need to consider. So the EU AI Act considers a whole range of specific use cases to be prohibited. Now, you may not go into or may not have these in your own organisation. These are probably aimed a little bit more at some of the developers or the providers of AI systems. But as a good example here, inferring emotions in the workplace. Now, I'm sure that you can come up with some good reasons why you might want to do that. You think you're going to be helping the happiness of your employees if you can identify their emotions. I've even talked to someone years past that that's something they were considering doing, but something that is not allowed under the EU AI Act. Now we move into things that are high risk. Now this means that you can do them, but you need to consider the risks and need to have the right things in place in order to be able to deploy or use these particular high risk cases. So one in particular I'll call out, which is perhaps a bit more prevalent across any organisation, is employment and worker management. So if you're thinking about recruitment or promotions, or just more generally the way that you manage your employees in the workplace, if there is AI that is assisting with that, if you're screening employees, screening potential recruits, those may all fit within this high risk category. And I think that is the category that may apply across quite broadly across most organisations. I'll also call out access to public and private services, which considers things like access to bank accounts, credit, insurance. So there are some things in there that might be considered essential services. And if you're using AI to determine whether someone is able to access those, again, they're considered high risk and you need to put the right guardrails in place. And finally, around transparency, even if they don't fit the prohibited or high risk categories, there are still some transparency requirements for certain use cases. So if you're chatting with an AI, you need to inform the user that they are chatting with an AI, that it's not a real person that they're chatting with. So there are some disclosure requirements there. There are some limited biometrics cases which are allowed, but you do need to disclose that. Now, if you are using deepfakes, you also need to be disclosing those. Now, if you do have these high-risk systems, you need to think about there's two types of organisations covered by high-risk systems. So providers, so this is things like the ChatGPTs and Anthropic with their Claude as an example, and then there are deployers. So these are the people that are using those models for actual use case. So deployers considers commercial entities using them for those particular use cases. So something we see across both is human oversight. So human oversight from providers to develop, and human oversight when you're deploying. So it's not just to deploy and forget, and it's also for deployers, the obligations are on you. You can't just ship them back to the provider. We always say, whoever owns the objectives owns the risks, and that is the same here. If you are deploying AI, you can't just rely on the provider to manage that for you. Next slide, thanks, David. Finally, just a reminder that what we just spoke about there was the EU AI Act specifically, but it doesn't matter whether you have that type of regulation. We've seen a number of regulators across the globe come out and say, we already have legislation that will cover the risks that AI would cause harm to society, to people. So misleading conduct, safety, David's mentioned bias a number of times, unfair practices. Many of these will already be governed under existing legislation, and we've seen a number of regulators say that they will enforce these existing laws when it comes to inappropriate use of AI that causes harm.
Thank you, Michael. And while you're talking, the more I think about it, this whole AI is just another source of incredible power. And with power becomes great uses and also becomes abuses and also comes risk. And I wasn't around when electricity was invented, but I can imagine the impact that had on society. How on earth could you get a light bulb to kind of come on across the room with a cable? We know electricity is incredibly powerful and valuable, yet it's incredibly risky if you don't know what you're doing. But over this amount of time, we know how to use electricity properly, and therefore we use it for good. But it needs those risks identified and those controls put in place. Now, thinking about then risks and controls, I want to move on now to what are the key AI risks and controls. And for us at Protecht, we typically think about anything new that comes along. It really needs to be adapted into our existing enterprise risk management framework. So anything new, whether it be AI, ESG, and so on, we always go, well, the ERM framework, if it's strong enough, your ERM GRC framework, it should be able to incorporate anything that comes along. Based on that, we took our standard approach to risk management and we thought about how does AI fit. I just want to take you through that. And for us, it's clearly linked very much to what is the definition of risk. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So our starting point of thinking about a framework always is, what are our objectives? What are our strategic objectives to change the organization? What are our operational objectives to run the organization? Now that is an end, or objectives are an end. What's the means to the end? We need our critical processes and critical projects in place, processes to deliver the operational objectives and projects to deliver the strategic objectives. Obviously, projects then get delivered, they then do a permanent change into the operating model. Now, at this stage, we have not considered risk. So it's time to consider risk now. What are the risks that could mess up the operating model and the projects, which means you do not deliver it against your objectives? And we have operational financial risks and strategic and project risk. We're going to delve into these risks a little bit more later. Now, the last piece we need to think about is managing those risks, the base and the foundation of the pyramid. And this is where enterprise risk management sits, covering both operational strategic risk and the bit in the middle, which is change delivered risk or risk in change, thinking about how your projects are going to change the business as usual risk profile, and isn't that very relevant for AI as we deploy? So that's the general model. Michael, how does kind of AI fit into this?
First, if we think about the AI implementation projects you might have, maybe you've got some pilots that you're currently running, there are risks to those projects, traditional project risk management around schedule, cost, very, very traditional risk categories. But then they will be pushed into your operating model. So you're going to have AI that is enhancing your operating model. We're going to talk about a couple of use cases a little bit later. Now, if you're not happy with the risks that that potentially introduces, you could maybe choose not to use AI. But as David's mentioned, there's some big risks in not using AI. Competitors are likely to be using it. It's who's going to be able to do this effectively, safely, and effectively. Now, of course, then you're going to have the risks from the internal use of AI. Once you've got that operating model that's enhanced by AI, it does introduce or change some of the existing risks within based on those use cases. Now, of course, there are also some other AI risks which are external. So we've talked before about things like deepfakes and the way that it's changing cyber risks. We're not really focusing on those today. We want to focus on how the internal risks change when you're using AI. And that's where we want to keep our focus for today. So David, based on this, do you want to move into, I guess, some of those strategic and operational objectives and risks?
Yes, so we cannot manage what we don't understand. So let's take a look at this third level of the pyramid to really understand our risks. And we're going to look firstly at the AI strategic risks. And we usually consider strategic risks based on three components. Firstly, strategic decision risk, which is the risk of making an erroneous or suboptimal strategic decision. And obviously this is all around AI. Now, a decision is also do nothing. And this is what a lot of people are doing because they are fearful of AI. Where do you think they're going to be in 1, 2, 3 years, or should I even say 6 months? They're going to be missing out on a massive opportunity. And we know what happens when you do not follow the market and what's happening in the world around strategy. You're called Kodak. right, or blockbuster or whatever, that's where you're going to end up. So there is a massive strategic risk of not adopting AI, but there's also a big strategic risk of adopting it incorrectly. Once we've then decided our strategy, then moves on to classic project risk or strategic execution, and it's all the risks of you deploying AI within the business. And this will cover the inability to deliver it on time, quality, cost overruns, and so on. Then we move to strategic delivered risk, which we generally manage through a process called risk in change. This is a really big one. And this is when you now go and implement AI into your business. You have not adequately considered all the operational risks ahead of time, and therefore you get into trouble. Now, this right now is happening everywhere. Why? Because a lot of deployment of AI into the business you do not know about, because your staff are going off and doing it. They're dropping your policies and confidential information into ChatGPT, and straight away you've got a massive increase in data protection risk, cyber risk, and you may not even be aware that's happening, but that is strategic delivered risk. Now, those risks are huge, and where we're combating those at the moment and having to make that balancing act, what do we do and how do we control it? We then move into the business as usual operational risks. Now, I've popped down 14 of them just to consider. Some of them are very much internal, like biases, discrimination, data privacy, and so on. But you've also then got the external ones, such as number 10, power for evil. Haven't we got that already with our scammers using constant AI to do all the phone calls and scamming your data? I was reading an article the other day, actually better than people that have been scamming for 5 or 6 years. The AI model was able to extract more data on the phone quicker than really seasoned scammer practitioners. Now, from each of these, it's going to depend very much on you as an organization of which of these risks are relevant, which are not, and which are big and which are small. And I think that's really important to appreciate the context before you can get your definitive list of AI risks understood. Michael.
Absolutely. And as you said before, about the operating model changes, and depending on how you use AI will depend on the types of risks that you face. There is not a, I want to use AI, what are the risks? It's, well, how do you want to use it? Or how is it being used in your organization? So for example, is it something that's built by a third party? Is it something that's in-house? For example, some machine learning models are things that people actually build internally. Is it open source? Is it commercial? Is it locally hosted? Many of these models are massive and you can't locally host them, or it's unlikely to be able to locally host them, but that some of them are a bit smaller, and some of them you can locally host, which means that there's data that's not being sent outside of the organization, which changes the cyber risks as an example. Who's interacting? Who's the beneficiary? Is it for your staff? Is it for your employees? How is it actually being used? And also, is it actually integrated into your products and services? If you're selling a service and you're integrating AI into that product, that is going to be a much different proposition than if it's just something that your employees can use internally. It's not really integrated with anything. And finally, is it something that's integrated with third parties, which again can change the risk and the attack vectors, particularly from a cyber perspective. So with that, how does that then fit into a risk taxonomy? Now, you may have heard of MIT's AI risk repository. It has over 700 risks in their library. It is an amazing resource in terms of a whole breadth of information about AI risks. It does have these level 1 risk domains that they have categorized as part of that repository. Now, my question is having a list of over 700 risks useful? You're not going to take those 700 risks and dump them into your risk library. That's not how you would use it. You really need to understand the context. And there are a few of these that I would perhaps say are not necessarily risks in themselves. So, malicious actors and misuse, I'd say, is more like a threat or a cause. And system failures, limitations are probably more like controls or missing controls. And the question is, how do you then adapt that? Do you need an AI risk taxonomy, or is it something that is just incorporated into your broader risk taxonomy? And David, I know that's something we've discussed and gone backwards and forwards about, and happy to hear your thoughts on this one. A good example is third-party risk management, which again influences all of the other risks that your organisation faces, but does have we're actually seeing it elevated enough to be its own risk category because it is so important. Any comments from you on that one, David?
Yeah, I guess, I've always come back to this fact that whenever something newish comes along, does your existing enterprise risk management framework and risk classifications taxonomy, can it handle it? And it really is a test of robustness of your framework. And by and large, as you know, Michael, whenever something new comes along, we throw it at the existing framework that we certainly live and breathe by. And by and large, the framework handles it already. So where possible, what we try and do is to say, well, is AI really a new risk category, or does it slot in to our existing taxonomy? Wherever possible, we slot it in. Where does it slot? Well, in a lot of these categories, I've already covered execution, strategic decision risk. What about fraud risk? It certainly slots in there. IT services, it certainly slots in there. People well-being, it certainly slots in there with Michael's autonomous forklift trucks. It impacts on human resources, and the whole recruitment availability if you're using AI. Information security, absolutely. I could go on. In many ways, AI, being like another employer that impacts on all of the others, also does. Now, that said, you may want, and the board of directors, executive management might want an AI risk report. So what you could do is within these categories, you could label, or what we at Protecht call tag, your sub-risks within them with the AI tag. If you've then got an appropriate reporting and risk management system, you could then run a report which you filter based on your AI tag, and you've got each of these components of risk pulled out that link to AI, and you've got your AI risk report without adding a whole bunch of new AI risk categories. So that would be my kind of view. Now, with that said, then, in terms of once we've identified our AI-related risks, which is what I'm going to call them, we then really need to understand that you cannot manage what you don't understand. And those of you that have watched Protecht's webinars before will know we love using risk bow tie analysis to understand our risks. And again, we've thrown that technique at the AI-related risk. And for those of you that need a refresher, or those of you who've not used bow tie analysis, a quick overview. And it runs on the principle that every risk we face is made up of components. Now, in terms of the components, the most important component is what we at Protecht call the main risk event. Other people call it the top risk event. And generally within a risk story that has a beginning and a middle and an end, the main risk event is what we often call the oh no moment. And that is during the day when something goes wrong and you put your head in your hand and you go, oh no. That is the point we're aiming for. In a traditional risk of cyber, that would be cyber intrusion, for example. Once we've got the main risk event, which should be the short name for the risk in the risk register or your risk records, you then move off to the left, root cause analysis. And that takes you, by using the words why, question why, back to the root causes of the risk. This is where it all starts. That is called the driver side of the risk that drives the main risk event to happen. And then we go to the other side by realizing that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So we have to link the main risk event to the objectives, and we do that on the right side, linking all the way down to impact on objectives. And there you have the bow tie. That is an inherent risk bow tie. It has no controls. So we now go and add the controls, typically preventative controls on the left, detective controls in the middle, and reactive corrective controls on the right-hand side. And there we have the classic residual risk bow tie with its components. Now, in addition, we treat risk management and compliance management very much in an interrelated way. Why? Because one of your objectives on the right-hand side, which could be impacted upon, should be to comply with. And for today, the EU AI Act, we'll take that one. If you do not comply, you have an impact. Therefore, one of the impacts links then to the regulatory obligations. And there's the linkage there. In addition, the regulatory obligation may require you to have a specific control in place. Thinking about driving a car, you have to wear a seatbelt in most jurisdictions. That therefore is a control, a recovery or reactive control, corrective control to minimize the impact, but it's also required by the regulatory obligation. So that is the view that we take of the picture of risk. Now, to apply that, Michael, I'm going to get you just to talk about maybe a single use case, and then we'll from that pick up one of the risks to give an example of an AI related risk using bow tie analysis.
And as I mentioned before, it's really all about context. What is the use case and what are the specific risks? So I'm just going to run through three use cases. We won't pull out all of the risks, but imagine that you've got a large language model that is used for customer interactions. Now you might actually start linking that to your CRM system and having it act as an agent and issuing sales documents. So it is almost contracting on your behalf. And you can see that there are a range of risks that would occur in that kind of case. Bias that can be inherent in the model, and maybe the way that the customer provides information results in them getting a biased response given the data that was trained on. You could have misuse, prompt manipulation, where your customers or the people interacting will try and trick the chatbot. There's an example of Chevrolet who implemented a chatbot, and a customer was able to convince the chatbot that they should sell them a Chevrolet for $1. Now that chatbot was not linked to any sort of sales process. It was not put out as a sales process. It was more of an information chatbot, so it wasn't something that Chevrolet committed to selling the vehicle at that price, but they quickly removed that chatbot from use. You can see if it was connected directly to a sales process, that would be problematic. So moving on, David, if we want to move to the next one on a knowledge base, this is something that I think has a lot of potential for a lot of organizations, is trying to train their knowledge base and integrate it with a large language model. Your internal data is the lifeline of your organization. It's what makes it different. But that can also lead to different types of risks, inaccurate outputs, data quality, insider threats. You could have people who are actively trying to modify the data that is being used or sourced to get outputs that are beneficial to them. And finally, this one might be a bridge too far for some people, but you could implement a call center that has audio-enabled AI to use as chatbots. And it's not like we haven't got some of this in place, but making it completely large language model driven or generative AI driven. Imagine you do that, and then you have a service disruption at the provider. You might not have a call center backup or a suite of real people who can then pick up the slack if that would happen. Now, we're going to focus on knowledge base and inaccurate outputs. We're going to build a bow tie based on that particular use case to show that these are different across these different contexts. Now, starting from inaccurate outputs, we can start say, well, what would that mean to my organization? This is the context of linking it to objectives. So if your staff are using that knowledge base and relying on that output, that could be poor decision making that impacts the organization. Maybe they rely on a policy for themselves, perhaps a leave policy that they don't like, but it's actually inaccurate. And they may then use it to pass that information on to customers or impacting customers, which can then impact on a range of other objectives of the organization, from fines, regulatory, and customer satisfaction. Now, from there, we can start thinking about that and asking, but why? Why would that happen? Why would we have inaccurate outputs? These are four main categories around biased data, data poisoning, prompt injections, ineffective prompts. And then we can dive a bit deeper and keep asking that question, but why? And here we've got an extrapolation of the biased data, where we can think about why would we have that? Is it external data in the model that we selected? Is it in our internal data? Is it that we've got, we didn't tune the data? We can really dive down into these individual components and understand why this risk would happen in this context. Now, David, once we've got here, we can then expand that whole bow tie. So let's do that for the entire bow tie. And then the question is, well, how do we manage that? How do we actually apply controls to this so that we can actually manage these risks in a more granular fashion to give us that assurance?
Yeah, so once we got the inherent risk, which is an example of inherent risk bow tie, no controls, let's have a look at AI controls. Now, I don't want to make this a general controls discussion, so we're thinking a little bit more about how are AI controls perhaps a little bit different. Well, firstly, key characteristics are the same as other controls. We are going to have preventative, detective, corrective type controls, but I want to look at some of the special considerations. Firstly, there should be a greater focus on preventative controls and very early detective controls. And the reason is that AI risk has a very high velocity. If you're not familiar with the word risk velocity, it's the speed at which a risk travels through its bow tie life, i.e. how quick does it go from those causes all the way through to the oh no moment, the risk event to the impacts on your objectives. And like anything in technology, it's extremely fast. And as soon as you get fast velocity or high velocity risk, you need to be preventing and very early detection, because it's going to be too late if you don't do anything preventative. The second one is that as AI is automated as a process, there should be much greater proportion of automated controls put in place. Having a human manually sit there and monitor AI for all its things is just not going to work. We've already said that this super employee is extremely quick, and by the time the actual humans blink, they've already done their analysis, they've come out of a report, and they've already sent it to a client. So we've got to make sure our controls have got a way higher level percentage of being automated. And the last thing I want you to think about is perhaps we could start using AI controls. So we build AI-based controls to control AI, and then we all go on holiday. No, because we need, as Michael said, in the EU Act, human oversight. Thank goodness that a regulator is going to keep us employed. I'm only joking, there's a role for all of us, of course there is. Now, what we want to do is, once we consider the risk and the controls, how should AI risk be managed, to delve deeper a bit more into the controls and risk management generally. So what we're going to think about is the management of AI risk has got two parts to it. Number one is risk treatment, which is really inbuilt into your processes, into your business, and then enterprise risk management as that separate but related function that oversees all of your risk. So firstly, thinking about risk treatment. So Protecht, we generally identify 7 types of treatment method, depending on whether the risk is already acceptable, it's too high, or it's too low, or we're over controlled. I won't go through all of these, but what we're trying to get to in great AI risk management is the top one, where we look at our risks and go, yeah, we're happy with them, they're within appetite, everything's good, next. But we're dreaming if we think we're going to get there overnight. We've got a lot of work to do. Typically, it's going to be in number 2, where the risk is too high. How do we reduce the risk to be within our appetite so that we're able to go ahead and utilize the power of AI? Now, in order to treat it, typically we start off by saying, can we transform the inherent risk process, i.e. process re-engineer? So for example, the risk of using or losing data externally to an external AI tool, then maybe initially we only deploy internally. Maybe it only looks at our internal data, doesn't look at our external data initially. Now, obviously, everything comes with restrictions. You're not going to get the power, but you've managed the risk from a process re-engineering perspective. As you get better, you might release it and then become more powerful over time with better controls. Now, the most obvious one is number 3, improve your controls. Add in new controls, plug control gaps and improve your existing controls. Number 4, I'm not sure we're going to go so well with this in AI, because this is about primarily insurance. And the question is, to what degree are insurance companies going to come to the party when we have AI related risk, probably an area of ongoing development. Number 5, accept the risk formally. This is if it's outside appetite. Not sure that's going to go down too well with the board of directors and the executive committee. So as it says there, use with extreme care. Number 6, a lot of people are doing this right now, avoiding the risk. It's all too scary, let's not do it. But the problem is it should say avoid the risk and avoid the opportunity, or avoid the benefit, because one doesn't come without the other. I don't think we're suffering from number 7. This happens in very mature risk areas where we've gone over control, we got a bit carried away, and as a result, it's excessive in terms of the risk reduction we're going to get. So by and large, it's going to be primarily numbers 2 and 3, and we're going to focus on number 3 a little bit later. Now, that is then frontline management within the business, built into every day. What about enterprise risk management? Now, we at Protecht use a dashboard, a dartboard, which we call enterprise risk management framework, and the key to it is the 3rd ring, which has got all our main processes of risk assessments, controls assurance, risk metrics, and so on and so forth, all attached to our central list of risks, our risk taxonomy. From there, we're going to then do our risk analysis, reporting, and escalation response, action, decision making, and so on. Now, all of those elements apply to AI risk management. So that framework should be robust enough without too much change to apply to all of your AI risks once you've done it. Now, the key is going to be those controls. So we now need to turn Michael's inherent risk bow tie into a residual one. Michael.
Yes, so here we've expanded all of those causes with some particular controls, but let's dive into the bias. So we mentioned before that use case where it might be biased because you've got poor quality internal data. Imagine, for example, that you've got policies that you're including as part of your data source. You might have versions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all stored in a drive. And if you haven't cleaned those up and your AI model doesn't know that the older ones shouldn't be trained on, that's going to cause a problem. So it's about making sure that you've got that kind of cleaning in hand. Make sure you've got all of the processes and the controls to address all the potential causes of bias in that organization or in that particular use case. So David, it's not enough just to have these controls and say that we've mapped them to all these causes. We need to have some level of assurance that they continue to be working on an ongoing basis. So do you want to talk us through that process?
Absolutely, and it's such a topical issue at the moment with a lot of global regulators, particularly in financial services, highlighting that the controls management in fin services companies particularly is not very good. And as we know, those of you in fin services, there's a lot of legislation coming out, or regulation, should I say, to improve. So very topical. Let's apply it to AI risks. Now, in terms of this, the controls management usually contains two main parts. One is control assurance. This is really testing that an individual control is effective or ineffective or partially effective, whatever you use. And that is control centric. It's over a single control, and typically we would assess the design effectiveness and the operating effectiveness. Once we've done that, though, we then need to move to the next level, because we want to understand how our controls are managing the related risks. And for that, we now need to group the controls around a risk together, and as a group say how effective are they. So we typically call that controls assessment, which is where we group it. This one has multiple controls, and this would then link to Michael's previous bow tie diagram where we had lots of controls attached to that risk, and we would then use that to move us from a view of inherent risk to residual risk. Now, again, I don't want to talk generally about controls assurance. I wanted to talk more about what you're going to have to do to get good controls assurance over the controls of your AI risks. And because they are going to be primarily automated, what are some of the things you need to consider when putting together a controls assurance and assessment process around automated controls? Well, firstly, the main principles of design and operating effectiveness are similar as for all controls. However, as we mentioned before about the controls, they need special consideration for automated controls. The first one is that many automated controls, you don't even know you have them, because they're really not easy to identify, because they're simply built in as part of the code, as part of the program or the tool or the AI model, and you might not even be aware they are there. So that's not a good start to do controls assurance. Secondly, are they known and identified? So in this instance, the identification of them needs to be an active exercise when you go through that AI model. Now, linked to that is, do they therefore have an owner? Well, if you don't know about them, they certainly won't have an owner. And even if you know about them, who's going to own the control embedded within an AI model? So you've got to be very clear who's responsible and accountable for that control. A control that's not owned is not a control, because it would do all sorts of crazy stuff and no one will know about it. Then you get to think about your design and operating effectiveness testing. So the greatest focus for design effectiveness is to ensure that the control is designed to be able to do what it's supposed to do in terms of achieving its objective. Now, this should be then carried out when the AI model is being developed. It should be part of your process design and your implementation, and that design effectiveness should be done initially at the UAT testing of the model of the program. And then after that, really focused on updating design effectiveness when any type of change occurs, change management. Then we move to operating effectiveness. Now here, operating effectiveness is the control done, given it is automated. Your focus should be on the nature of the control environment. How stable is the environment? What's the degree of change in that environment? What's the access controls that you've got? What's the overall reliability? Now, if you've got a very reliable, stable environment, then you don't need to do a lot of operating effectiveness. Once one of these things happens once, correctly, it'll happen again and again correctly. Get it wrong once, then you'll have a problem. This is the lumpiness that Michael spoke about previously with the automated cars, is it'll be good all the time it works, it goes wrong, it goes horribly wrong. As a result, think about how you will adjust your design and operating effectiveness based on automated controls. Now, moving on to actually enterprise risk management, what's interesting for us is always thinking about utilizing existing capability. Given that AI is a model, the use and leveraging of model risk management is a smart move if you have that in place, and a lot of fin services companies certainly do. So think about how you leverage it. Michael, how do we leverage model risk management?
So for those who may not be familiar with model risk management, it's, as David said, typically in financial services, looking at things like credit models, capital models, often financial in nature, but not exclusively. So there is a lot of capability around model risk management. Typically they've been around machine learning models, but they can also apply to generative AI or other types of models as well. So at a high level, if you think about model development, you still need to develop that model in very much the same way, but there may be some differences for generative AI in particular. So if you're thinking about data calibration, data cleansing, when you're using a lot of quantitative data like financial data, that's one thing. But when you start using things like, if you use our use case of the knowledge base, what is the data that you need? How are you going to clean that? So there are some differences that you may need to pay attention to during that model development phase. Now, when you're looking at model validation, one of the key steps is, how do you benchmark that the model is actually giving you the results that you want? As David mentioned earlier, things like ChatGPT or some of these large language models come up with answers that sound plausible, but may have no grounding in reality. So you need some form of benchmarking to ensure that the outputs that you get, whether it's your staff, your customers, that you have some way of benchmarking some of these more qualitative type approaches to make sure you get those outputs that you need. Now, in terms of model use, there needs to be an approval process for how that is used. So really that approval process needs to consider some of these previous steps. Have we gone through all of the right processes to manage the risks before it is approved for use? And those people who are approving probably need some understanding of those risks that are potentially being applied. And finally, in that final phase around model control and monitoring, yes, we need to think about the controls that David has spoken about that you need specific assurance over. But part of that monitoring process is around change management. Once you've implemented that model, how are you modifying the model over time? How is it changing? If you're using a third party, how are they changing it, and are they informing you of those changes? So you may have these model risk management processes in place. Try and leverage them if you have them, but make sure that you tailor them and see if there's some specific things you need to capture from particularly if you're using generative AI or agents, what tweaks might you need to make to your model or your framework so that you can capture that information more collectively. So David, with that, thinking about these processes, we then need to think about who should be managing AI and AI risk. And the key for me here is it's not the risk manager who's in the driver's seat here. Someone in your organization is defining your AI strategy, or should be defining your AI strategy. They shouldn't be leaving it to chance. And it is really those people that are driving the strategy that need to own the risks and therefore also need to own the controls. Yes, a risk manager might have a place to play in terms of particularly around education or figure out what might need to happen, but they're not the ones who necessarily need to make it happen. So depending on your organization, and again, the context around your particular use cases in your organization, you might have a different driver. So you might have a CTO, CIO, if you're integrating into your products, that it might be owned by product. I think it will really depend on how the organization is implementing AI and what their strategy is as to who owns that. They've also included Chief Operating Officer, because if you're integrating multiple use cases, does someone need to be overseeing all of those use cases collectively? I think this is where the cross-collaboration is really key, making sure that you're getting all the right people in the room. It's not one person or a small group of people even that need to manage this. I think the other key message for me is make sure you take your passengers along for the ride. You need to communicate what is your AI strategy? How are you managing the risks to AI? What is the expectation for those passengers? Because if you don't tell them what that is, they might get into the wrong vehicle. and start, driving somewhere else. They might have shadow AI. They're just implementing their own use cases because no one has told them what they need to be doing. So we always say at Protecht, everyone's a risk manager. But David, how do we bring that to life? When we think about the 3 lines model as an example, how do we actually implement that in an organisation?
I guess like I've covered before, I like to use a bit of an analogy and then we'll apply AI. So firstly, if we ignore AI for a second and instead bring going for a walk. Our objectives is to go for a lovely walk, feel good. Look outside, the big dark cloud above you, a rain cloud. That represents the root cause of a getting wet and miserable and cold risk. And therefore we've got the beginning, the cause, and we've got the ultimate objective. It's almost like a bow tie on its end, beginning and end. Now, I don't know about you, what could we do if we see that cloud? We could run inside and go, you know what, I'm not going now. That's called avoidance, and you completely miss the reward of going for that walk. This is the people that shy away from AI and go, we're not going to touch it. Or you could take an umbrella. That umbrella is everything we've been talking about in this webinar, which is our internal control system. Now, those controls operate at the first point that risk occurs. Therefore, it's known as line 1, and that's embedded across every aspect of our business. It's generally looked after by our non-risk people. This is our everyday employee that's doing their day-to-day job. They also look after controls. Now, if they don't do such a great job, we're going to get leakage. And as a result, once we've got a little bit of leakage, we need to say, what else are we going to have? And this is where risk management, or line 2, comes in. Most importantly, risk management line 2 is not a second umbrella. As we're going to see in a second, they are there to review and challenge the owners of the first umbrella to ensure that it's effective and efficient. If they fail, do we give up? No, we've now got internal audit, our line 3, to give independent assurance that the other 2 lines are working effectively. And if that doesn't work, time to go home, because you've now got a failure in your objectives. That is our simple 3 lines model. And as Michael was highlighting earlier, risk and control ownership operates at line 1. Line 1 are by far the biggest risk managers in any organization. A lot of organizations are not using them. You need to deploy your line 1 people to be the risk managers. They own the objective, they own the risk, and they own the controls, and they own the effectiveness of the controls. So controls assurance that we just spoke about should be done at line 1. What do line 2 and 3 do other than going on holiday? Number 2, review and challenge. They are there to review and challenge, not do the work on behalf of line 1, and line 3, independent assurance. That's how the model should work. I know there's a lot of critique around the 3 lines model, but the principles of segregation and the independent set of eyes and review is the critical aspect, whatever line model you call it. So that brings us to what should be the cadence of AI risk management. How often should you do it? Well, the first issue, as we spoke about earlier, the cadence should be determined by risk velocity and risk changeability. Now, as we spoke about, velocity of AI-related risk is very fast. The faster the velocity, the more frequent and the higher the cadence should be of your risk management. Changeability, how quickly do these risks change? Well, as AI is developing rapidly, there's like, I don't know how many new AI models come out every week, and each one of them probably has a new, slightly changed risk if you are going to use it. Now, as we mentioned on both of these, it's very high for AI risk, and therefore the cadence should be very, very high. And that means you need to have your risk management on an ongoing, almost real-time basis to the degree you can, not once a quarter or once a month. So as a result, you need to build it into day-to-day. So you need real-time risk management as soon as possible and as frequently as possible. It also means your controls, as we said before, should be focused on preventive and detective controls, not reactive, because of the speed. And risk management should be as real-time as possible, applied every time there is a change in your AI model as part of your change management, as Michael spoke about, greater frequency of KRI reporting and controls testing, immediate management of incidents as they occur, and more frequently reporting, especially in this development phase. A lot of work to be done. Now, a lot of organizations do not have kind of real-time risk management. They're still sitting at once a month, once a quarter. It doesn't really cut it for these high velocity risks such as AI risks. Now, we sometimes forget this because we talk so much about the kind of input is the output of a risk manager as artists is our reporting. And Michael, I'm going to hand over you to quickly run through our reporting around AI risks, and then I might just finish up with pulling it all together. Michael.
So when it comes to any type of risk reporting, we consider there to be three main purposes of risk reporting: to provide assurance, provide warnings or red puffs of smoke signals for people to act, and to assist in better risk-reward decision making. And that's the same for controls, AI, whichever lens you want to look at it through, that purpose should remain the same. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about model risk management, and here is an example of how you might present the models that you're using in your organisation, which could be based on some of the key characteristics. Where are they in their life cycle? When were they last reviewed? Again, to provide that level of assurance. Now, if you aren't using model risk management, you might be using more typical controls management. This brings us to a controls dashboard where we can look at just a range of controls that you have. David mentioned automation before, so you might want to consider how much of that is currently automated and can we automate more moving forward. And this gives you a bit of a way to benchmark that. One thing we're also seeing more of is analysing controls by particular frameworks. And this is quite applicable to AI risks because many of the existing information security frameworks will have some application or fairly big overlap with AI. And I'm assuming probably won't be long before we'll have some specific control frameworks around AI. So being able to map how you're mapping against those is one crucial element we're finding is becoming more useful for our customers. Now, beyond that, you might also be looking more at an individual framework and delving deeper into a specific framework. So here, next slide, thanks, David, is an example of a ISO 27001 framework report where you can start reporting more specifically against these. Now, as AI is becoming more prolific, more people will be asking, what does your control framework look like and how does it map to some of the known standards? So this allows you to report against those and find out where you might have any gaps. Now, beyond that, you might have the traditional sort of controls assurance cadence that David was talking about, and being able to use that to then identify, is our cadence working as intended? Are we running all of the tests on time as we expected or as we forecast? But also being able to use the outcome of that assurance to say which of the risks are we now exposed to or have changed in exposure because we have a control we've identified that is ineffective. So being able to surface that information really quickly can help risk managers determine, particularly for AI risks that we're talking about today, are there things that we need to be addressing really quickly to close some of these gaps? So Dave, that's walked us through some of the more traditional controls reporting, model risk management, more specific. How do we bring all that together into a more integrated approach across all of the risk information that we capture?
Great, thank you, Michael. And yeah, very passionate at Protecht about this approach, and I think it's becoming more and more critical. And integrated dynamic risk profiling, when I swallow the dictionary, or we shorten it down to risk in motion, or our health score reports. And the logic behind it, as I just show you this example, is that for a specific risk, we have got lots and lots of information from different risk management processes. Whether it's the information from a risk assessment of inherent and residual risk, whether it's information from our controls management and controls assurance, whether we've got some compliance and controls attestations, key risk indicators, outstanding issues and actions, audit findings and incidents. Now, as long as your enterprise risk management system is designed to be able to link the data together, which as absolutely is, because it's what we live and breathe, then we can link all of that information into our central risk classifications or taxonomy that Michael showed you earlier. That then enables us to then create an aggregated report where we are now showing all of the components of risk linked to that risk category. So for example, if I go number 5 down at the bottom, information technology, you can run across that and it gives you all of the current information based on those various risk processes. This then in this instance, this is rolled up to information technology business unit, and within that it will have a whole range of risks. And as a result, within that, you'll get the detailed risk rolling up to information technology. And from there, we can then roll it up to a higher level, such as the corporate office. And what's really key here is, so what? Why do we do this? And it's really along the top. we can then set ourselves as a target for our house score, and each manager, executive manager, board member knows what makes that up. And as you can see here, we're doing okay, except actions house score 1.5, really letting us down, and also audit findings in amber. And this then enables us to focus on what really matters in our risk management and bring that score up to a higher level. Is there a little bit of smoke and mirrors around the scoring? Of course there is, but fundamentally it's a way of aggregating all of our information together and then creating actions and responses from it to improve our risk management. Now that brings us to our conclusions. I feel like we've covered an awful lot of ground. I hope you have too. And Michael, just maybe a final comment from you, and then I'll have my own and we'll conclude the webinar.
I think context is king. Understand what are the use cases that you want to develop for AI, because you won't know what the risks of AI are to your organization until you understand the use cases, and then you can balance that risk and reward.
Yeah. And I guess mine is that AI is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And if you fail to embrace it, you will fall backwards. And it could be a major strategic risk that you take and you might not be around. That said, if you go in and you're going without your eyes wide open and good risk management and controls management, you could also end up on the waste heap because the risks have destroyed you. So you need to go in with a good balance of risk reward into taking on AI, but it's here to stay. You need to embrace it. So I just want to finish up now with some QR codes that we'll share with you across our three main areas. One is our Protecht ERM risk management system. You can find out more with that QR code. Number two is our knowledge hub. There's an awful lot of information in there. We just highlighted a new ebook that we have out. And also, as Michael mentioned, mine and Michael's passion in life from a business perspective is our training platform, Protecht Academy, and that has got about 14 courses on there, myself and Michael delivering. If you like our style, if you don't look. And, you can click the QR code and find out more there. So just to finish up with, I want to say a really big thank you to Michael. You would have noticed that Michael had a slight microphone issue. He's got an AI-powered microphone. No, he hasn't, and didn't quite manage the risk well. It still was able to be heard, but I know you had to listen a bit hard. We were aware of it, but it was very difficult to fix prior to this webinar. But I heard every word, but you just might have had to be a bit attentive. We apologise, but hopefully it didn't affect the webinar too much. And thank you to all of you that spent your time in an hour of listening to us. Hopefully you got something out of it. And I would just remind you, if you could please now spend a minute or so to just do the post-webinar feedback form. That is a great value to us, and hopefully we see you on a future webinar. And take care. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, David. Thank you, everyone.